This episode contains discussions about racism and discussions of racial slurs directed at Asian peoples and Asian American peoples and communities. Viewer discretion is advised. Welcome, guys, gals, and non-binary pals, to a very special episode of the Game Maker's Guide. This is the only episode thus far that is a round two. Count them, 1, 2. This is for our second recording with one Sen-Foong Lim, a wonderful person. Got to talk to him the first time, and also known for a variety of RPGs and board games that he's developed. What am I trying to say? Welcome, Sen. That is what I'm trying to say at this point.
Thanks for having me, Ty. How are you doing today?
Not too bad. Yeah. And then you?
I'm doing okay. Yeah, it's good. I'm still on vacation, so it was nice to actually not have something to do today, but say, oh, I have the free time to correct the mistake that I made. So let's go. It's good.
Well, would you like to go over some of the works that you have produced, some of which that the audience might be aware of?
Sure. So I think RPGs. Let's start with RPGs. So RPGs, the one that I am probably most widely known for is Jiangxi, Blood in the Banquet Hall, which I co-wrote with Banana Chan, and it is about running a Chinese restaurant as an immigrant family, a multi-generational immigrant family, while fighting off vampires. So that's fun. And then I have been a writer for many of the systems that are kind of making it big in the indie scene, like Kids on Bikes and Kids in Space and all that kind of stuff. So that's where I usually spend my RPG time, is more on the indie side of things, although I have written some D&D adventures and whatnot. That haven't been published yet, so they're coming out in the future. And then in board gaming, I've done a lot more work in board gaming, where probably people would know me from my first big box game, which was Belfort, and then from a whole bunch of licensed products that I've made, like Scooby-Doo, Escape from the Haunted Manor, which is kind of like an escape room in a box, and games like Kingdom Rush, Rift in Time, which made like well over $1 million on Kickstarter. So lots of games, lots of fun, and all the way from tons of miniatures and plastic and to very simple cards to one-page RPGs. I like games, so I think they're a fundamental part of living. And so I like to make any type of game, except video games for some reason. I just have never had a real inclination to do that, although I love video games, but I've never really felt like making one.
Huh. Interesting. That is very interesting. I can understand, like, there's definitely almost like a loss in translation, I think, because with board games and tabletop games, it's inherent for like the community aspect, while for video games it can be a little bit more of like either a solo experience, and you can also have like larger multiplayer things, but you don't really get like the face-to-face connection, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely part of it, but I think for me, the literal part of it is because I don't have the skills to make it myself, right? And so I was very much growing up that kind of perfectionist, that kind of person who, when the group was like floundering, it's like, I'll do it all, and I'd take it on my back, and I'd just carry the group, and we'd get a great mark, and I'd feel bad and rotten. I'd hate the people I was in the group with, but I'd say I still got my A+. So that was me. And I still do that with games, or I don't do that anymore. But when I started, I kind of felt that way, right? Like, oh, I have to do it all myself. I have to be able to do this all myself. And so board, card, and RPG, tabletop stuff, was much more accessible. It's just easier to do. Doesn't make it easier, but it makes it easier to actually get like a prototype out. So much so that, in fact, that, I often recommend, game designers of any kind, start with a paper prototype. It's real simple. You don't have to code a single thing. But yeah, I mean, would I like to make a video game someday? Sure. Can old dogs learn new tricks? Maybe. Do you consider Twine a video game? not really, but that's my level of, not coding, but using technology to make game-like things so far. So, um, yeah, it's that kind of thing where I think if I had a team of people, coders and all that kind of stuff to do it, I would definitely do it. But most of my friends are more in the analog sphere, anyways, and everybody else who isn't is like attached to AAA projects. So they're like, I don't have time for that. I'm sleeping under my desk and eating pizza. So I have living in London, Ontario. I have a lot of friends in AAA because we have a studio here that makes what's that game? Um, you know, you're ninjas in outer space. Warframe. They make Warframe, and so a
Oh,
lot of my friends are like level designers and artists and coders for Warframe and QA dev and whatnot. Yeah. So it's Digital Extremes is in London, and they are a pretty big deal. It's a great game. I haven't played it in a while, but it's really really cool. So anyway,
oh yeah.
that's who I know, and they're like, "No, I have no time for you and your piddly little ideas." Now they all do love, role playing games or tabletop games and all that kind of stuff, but they don't have the time to make my ideas into video games. They're just busy doing that with other things like games. Tabletop games for them are relaxation, right? And video games are like work. And obviously they do play video games as well, but it's like if they asked me to make a board game for them out of something they wanted, I'd be like, that's work for me, man. Now, of course, I could pay them, but they still they don't have the time. It's okay. I'll figure it out someday.
How selfish of them not to just donate full hours of their day for.
I know, right? For big old exposure bucks. I don't pay an exposure bucks. I would never do that to somebody.
So I am curious about one thing you said.
Yeah.
When you're developing games, do you prefer like you being able to have more control nowadays of like the full concept or working in a team?
Oh, I always work in teams. I never work alone. Why? Because I've come to realize as I get older and maybe a little bit wiser that I am not great at everything and I'm not perfect. And other people have better ideas than I do about things that I might have started in my head and they can finish in reality. My favorite part about making games is actually seeing what other people do with these things that popped out of my head. So when I see like a cover for a box, or when I see, somebody else implement an idea that I had and then add their little twist to it, it's like, oh my God, that is perfecter. It's better than what I had thought about. And I think in recognizing the success that we've had with games and that other people are contributing to that success in a really big part, really big way, makes me much more comfortable with working with allowing people. That sounds really weird, but letting people in a way, right? It's that kind of thing where I trust people to do a good job, working with professionals. So that's the other thing, right? If you surround yourself with a good group of people, you're going to have a great product, which is very different than at school when your teacher says, you, and you are in group A, and you end up with this kind of crapshoot of who you're going to get. Now, of course, everybody liked to be on the group with me because they knew I would do all the work. And it would be pretty good at the end of it. But as you take on bigger and bigger and bigger projects, you quickly realize that I have the vision, but I don't have the skills to make it all happen. And that's okay. Now, there are definitely people who do, and they make it all by themselves, and they're, the triple threat. They're like a designer and an artist and a writer or whatever. And that's great. And they can do it. Most of them aren't super prolific, but their one or two major products are great. And that's totally fine. You can totally be that person. But I still do like working with other people because there's a lot of reasons. So one of my prime reasons for working with other people is because the proof of the concept is literally done just by talking to the other person. A lot of times when you're designing in your head, and you go, "Oh yeah, this is gonna be a great idea. It's good. Oh yeah, yeah, poo, it's perfect." And you get it out, and then you test it with people. Like they're like, I don't know what you're trying to do here, but it's not hitting the mark." Whereas with my process, working with my design partners, we've hashed that out already just by talking. Hey, Jay, what do you think of this idea? He'll go, I don't get it at all. And then I'll have to spend, a little time with him trying to explain it. And at the end of it, it's like, if I can't explain it to him, how am I going to teach other people who aren't like, my best friends and like on the same wavelength as me? And so a lot of our ideas kind of die in that fire, in a good way, where it's like, yeah, it didn't pass the friend test, the Sen and Jay test, or the Sen and Jesse test, or the Sen and Erica test. Whereas a lot of solo designers will just kind of go for it, and then they have to rely on other people to do it, which I do as well. I just get it at it earlier.
Talking about your, like, the different tests that you have in place, and kind of the friendship test for figuring out how the different rules are operating, making sure that people understand each other. Like, how did that start out? Like, where did you find your start in game building and game making?
Well, I mean, I've been building games ever since I was a little kid. I got started in role playing when I was 6 years old, and my parents didn't know what to do with me. They were like fed up, I guess, with me in a way. I was that precocious kid who would have read The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings twice by the age of 6. And my parents were like, I don't know what else to do with him. And my mom, being an avid BBC listener, had found out somehow about this magical thing called Dungeons and Dragons. And this was in 1978 when I first started. So she dropped me off in the basement of a local university college, where it was me and a bunch of, 20-year-olds. And we played games all Saturday morning into the afternoon. So, like, I'd finish my swimming lessons, and then I would either go home and watch, Super Friends and Scooby Doo, or I would go do this. And this is what I eventually learned to prefer, or, wanted to do, was play games. And so started with Dungeons and Dragons, and did Marvel superheroes and villains and vigilantes and champions. And then we also played a lot of board games like Titan and Car Wars and Wiz War, and all these games that were very much based around the whole early Steve Jackson line and TSR. Those were a lot of the main companies that were making games. Avalon Hill, so early games in terms of hobby gaming. And from there, I would turn everything into a game. Like, anytime I had a school project, I'd make a game. I had friends who just recently reconnected with me from my elementary school days. And like, remember that game you made when you were like, when we were in this grade, and it had like 3 levels, and one was underwater and one was on the surface of the water and the other one was the air. That was so cool, right? And I've been making games forever. My friends didn't like Dungeons and Dragons because they didn't necessarily like playing theater of mind. So I took all my Lego and I would make dungeons for them out of Lego, and we'd march like little Lego figures in there. And this was actually right at the time when the castle sets just came out. So it's like, perfect. Get me some castle sets, Mom, because I'm going to make some dungeons. And it was super fun. We just used D6s because every time they looked at the polyhedral dice, they're like, I don't know. I don't like these dice. But a D6 was fine. So I based everything on D6s. We used to count movement in like the studs, like Lego studs. Like, you can move this far and you can shoot your arrow this far. And we'd have like, a piece of Lego that was built that far to like do range finding with. So yeah, that was super fun. And it lasted a long time. Like, we played for like several summers with that Lego set of kind of Dungeons and Dragons. It was more like Hero Quest, really. And actually, that's a game that my friends would play was Hero Quest, because it wasn't so theater of mind. They could actually grasp pieces and move them around. So they like that a lot more. So yeah, I've been playing games for, what is it now? 42 years of my life. Yeah, a long time. It's good. It's good though. And then school got in the way of gaming, I think. Yeah, pretty much. When I was in university, I was still gaming a lot, much to my detriment, unfortunately, and much to the dismay of my marks and my wallet. I was playing a lot of role playing games, Warhammer, Magic the Gathering when it first came out. And the thing was that I basically had to get them out of my life in order to do my post-grad work. Otherwise, I would not have done my post-grad work. First of all, because I paid for my post-grad work by selling my Magic cards. I sold so many Magic cards that I was able to pay for another 4 years of school. That's a lot of Magic cards. Actually, it was not that many Magic cards if you think about it, but it was still a lot of money. And but Magic has a very special place in my heart and in my history as a game designer because it's where I really first learned how to peel back the veil and like look at the math and balance of, oh, this is why this is a 1/1 flying first strike creature and why it costs this much. Oh, see, compared to this other 1/1 creature that doesn't fly, it's this. So flying in first strike must cost somewhere in there. Oh, cool, right? So I was able to do all the math, figure everything out, and then Richard broke it again, but whatever. it's it was a really good system to kind of cut my teeth on in terms of learning about how games are designed in a more intricate fashion. I didn't really think about designing games before that. I was more just playing them. But Magic really got me thinking about, I could make these. I could make something like this, couldn't I? But school got in the way and I sold them all. And what happened was because I still had a need to play games, as humans do. Humans play games. That's what we do. It's how we learn. That's how we socialize. Games are a big part of most people's lives, whether they think of themselves as a gamer or not, whether it's games or sport or something like that. People need entertainment in many ways. So I found or was shown, my friend Errol, who was one of my housemates, showed me German games, is what he called them. They're these German games, Sen. It's like, oh, what are those? And it's like, it's called the Settlers of Catan, and it's like Bonanza, and all these weird games about beans and islands that you populated. And so we played those. And the great thing about board games and card games for me, which is why I got started playing them, but also why I got started designing them, was because they were just easier to put away. When you're doing a post-grad degree, you don't have tons of time for gaming, unfortunately. And so with a role-playing game, a regular day of role-playing for me would be not the day of role-playing, it'd be the whole week leading up to the day that I was playing that game, right? Either if I was the GM, it'd be a whole lot of work. If I wasn't the GM, I'd still be thinking about my character's backstory and, oh, I'm a bard, I got to write a new song or something silly like that. Because I like that kind of stuff. I think that's fun. But the problem is that it eats up a whole lot of your brain space, right? And same thing with like Magic, same thing with Warhammer. I was constantly building armies or making decks just in my head while I was supposed to be doing other stuff, because it kind of lives there and cycles around in there. Oh, well, what if I, took out my Shivan Dragon and put in this Nightmare instead? Then I could make a black-red deck, and my head would just explode and all the possibilities, and I'd just be washing the dishes or something and be thinking about this stuff. I'd be there for hours just thinking. And so in order to combat that time suckage, I sold everything. All my Magic, all my Warhammer. My role-playing games I didn't sell because, who wants those? You put them in a box. But because I still needed games to play or still wanted to play games, we just started playing board games. The beautiful thing about board games is close the box, put it on the shelf. I don't think about them at all. I just don't. Because the meta isn't there, right? For most of the board games. So it was a nice switch, and I could still play the games while I was not, what's the word? Consumed by them. Yet somehow I still managed to let it become my life in the end. Who knows? That's games, right? They get you in the end. And how I first started making games was really Jay, one of my other housemates, and I decided, hey, let's try making games because we're pretty good at stuff and we like doing things and we're creative. We can do that. And we did it and we failed entirely. This is in the days before Kickstarter, by the way. We tried to make a game and it was horrible. And so we said, I guess we suck. And we put it on the shelf and we put it away for a long, long time until like 7 years later when we were making another game after we had published, 2 or 3 other games. We were working on a game. We said, oh, but this needs something special. What could it need? And lo and behold, what we used to make this game called Akratiri special was mechanisms from the very first game that we shelved. It's like, and that's why Akratiri has a very special place in my heart, because it's like a sign that perseverance is, a good quality in life. Like, hey, that thing that we thought was garbage, not garbage, just not useful now, and it can become something really cool later. So yeah, it originally actually started, board game design actually started as a way to keep in touch with Jay. Jay had moved out west to British Columbia for work, and we had wanted to, stick together as friends. And it's tough when you are, a continent apart, basically, to actually remain in close contact with people when you don't do stuff with them. And there's so many more ways now to do that. Back then, I mean, like the best online game was probably like Halo, right? Or you were involved in like a MUD, like a multi-user dungeon or something like that. There was no such thing as BattleNet. BattleNet had just really gotten started. There was really not a lot of stuff around, multi-user dungeons, or not multi-user dungeons, that's a MUD, but like MMO RPGs. And Jay wouldn't have played them anyways. He was not an RPG player. He was more like, I like Warcraft, but I don't really like World of Warcraft. It didn't exist anyway. But when it did, he was like, I don't want to play that. So we decided we'd make games instead. And so that's what we started doing, was making board games. And eventually other people would play them. I don't know how that actually started. Be like, hey, you should play our game. Okay. I mean, maybe that's how it started. And we got some of our friends to play. Like, this is actually really good. You should do something with it. And so we did. And we took it down to GAMA, which is the Game Manufacturers of America's conference. And we got a couple games signed. And then we got more signed. And then we got more signed until we're like making games as a jobby. It's not quite a hobby. It's not quite a job. We would love to, well, not so much me, but Jay would love to like leave his job and just do games, which he's making moves towards, which is perfect. But not a lot of people can actually make a full-time job out of games. Not people who live in Vancouver and have 2 kids, and not people who have, 2 teenagers going into university next year. They can't do that. They being me. It's hard. It's really difficult because, you have a lifestyle that you're accustomed to. It would be a very big hit to income when you're relying on sales of stuff that who knows if people are going to like it or not. So yeah, it's a big life switch. It's and I, kudos to anybody who tries and does and succeeds, and even more kudos to people who try and fail and still keep on going, because it's a tough grind, but it's a labor of love for most people. Most people who are in the industry are in it because they love it, not because it's lucrative, because it certainly isn't. It can be, but it isn't for like the most people. It's not like, I don't know, computers, where you're guaranteed to make something of it. Where games, it's like, no, maybe not. Like, who knows how many units this will sell? And will it be something that we are like, one print run and we're done? I guess we got to make a new game, or is it something that will sustain you for a very long time? So yeah, there's lots of questions there, but yeah, we want to work on games for like the rest of our lives. Whether it becomes our sole livelihood is more dictated by, I think, other things around us. Like, living in Vancouver for Jay, it's not real easy for him to step away from full-time employment, because he was just looking for houses, and oh my God, the houses are like, $1.5 million for a house that's smaller than the one that I live in Ontario. So it's getting kind of weird out there in the housing land. So what's it like in Montreal? Are houses expensive?
Oh, I mean, thankfully, apartments, if you have things like roommates and you don't have to worry about kids and mortgages and all that kind of stuff, then it's all right. But yeah, no, just well, also everywhere I think is especially hot right now with COVID being a thing.
Yeah, it's all very weird.
Yeah,
All very weird.
like I can remember my dad telling me that the house that I grew up in, he spoke to a realtor, and it's out in the middle of nowhere. There's like no city life. There's no nothing. It's just endless fields, and he was
Right.
the realtor was looking up to like upwards of 500,000 just for a house out in the middle of nowhere.
Oh yeah, like not even in Chatham proper.
No,
Like you're talking like
no,
on the outskirts of Chatham
yeah, this is like boonies.
in good old Essex County. Okay.
Like nowhere near the 401. Getting to Toronto would be at least like a 4-hour drive. Getting anywhere notable is like an hour drive anywhere. Like, and yet still 500,000. Like, it's crazy right now.
Yeah, we checked in Hamilton because Hamilton's really really hot in terms of the market right now, and we used to live right next to the hospital where my wife worked, and we bought that house for like $146,000 when I graduated university, and I mean when we sold it, we still made a profit, but it's like in the 900,000s right now. And it's a small little house. It's like a 3/4 split. It is over 120 years old. It was a century house when we owned it. So yeah, it is. The housing prices are ridiculous. But anyway, that is what drove us actually to not go into games full time, but also, work and travel. Just to loop it all back to what we're talking about for real. I I think when you move apart from your friends, you sometimes need something to do with them in order to remain friends or to remain as tight as you were. And for guys, unfortunately, I think that is not a truism for everybody, but lots of guys feel that way. Like I don't see that person anymore because we don't play on the same sports team anymore. So I guess we're not friends. I guess we don't talk to each other because you're not just going to pick up your phone and talk to them about their kids and their day at work. It's just not something that a lot of men in North America feel comfortable with doing. I hope that changes, but you never know.
I suppose kind of refocusing back, what is it, to games as it is, and
Oh yeah, those things.
turning it a little bit less away from Tyson and Sen just have a conversation and people listen. Uh, I suppose last time we had spoken a lot about like building games and experiencing games through the lens of empathy when creating, and you had mentioned that that's a bit of a focal point through your game construction.
Yeah, definitely. Much more in RPGs than in board and card. Um, and there's a reason. There's a really distinct reason for that. I actually don't think board and card games are that good for teaching in and of themselves, without like an express curricula behind it or reflective questions behind them. Whereas RPGs have that part of embodied learning where you take on the role, but also RPGs have a culture where having a debrief at the end is very typical. Like in my game that I play tomorrow, we will always end with stars and wishes, right? Or people talking about what did I think was the best, what did I think we want to see next week, that kind of stuff. And so we have those debrief opportunities in role playing games. And for a lot of learning in terms of how we learn as humans, pedagogically, andragogically, whatever you want to talk about, whether it's kids or adults, that reflective piece is really, really critical to deeply embed learning. So you might know this because you're Canadian. If you remember the Nestle Quick commercial where where the boy lost the hockey game, do you remember?
Oh, goodness me. That sounds familiar. It's not coming to the top of my head.
Yeah. Anyway, and the mom says, "Well, did you have fun?" He's like, "Yeah." And then he's like smiles about his loss of the hockey game. But that reflection back on did you have fun is learning for that child that it's not about win or lose. It's about, did you play the game? Did you participate? Did you have an enjoyable time? And the same thing works for a lot of educational processes. Like, so if, like, let's say in my class, I was teaching behavioral technique, or even worse, like a holding technique for a crisis intervention strategy. If after we do it, I'll talk to the students about, okay, so tell me, how did it feel when somebody struggled when you held them this way? Or how do you think you could change that if the person did X, Y, or Z, right? So all those reflective questions where they go back and think, okay, what was going on? And so for building empathy through gaming, I think RPGs have a lot more going for them because we can do that. We can ask those questions without it seeming out of place. They're also, RPGs don't have a winner or a loser necessarily. And so they're better set up in that way, because a lot of times when we're trying to teach life situations or empathy, or have empathy towards different situations, there may not really be a winner or a loser, but there's a message. And board games tend to be about winning. winning. And there was actually just a recent case where a board game that was a video game got canceled because of the theme. And the theme was running a prison. It was not the greatest of themes. It had already been a very popular video game, but video games are a different media, right? So when you're a game, like you said, connected around the table, having fun, do you really want to take on the role of a prison controller who is trying to get points by, using prison labor? Does that create empathy? No, because you're gaining points. I'm winning if I do this. I'm reinforced if I do this. This is a good thing, except it's not, right? Culturally, that's not a great thing. And so when you did that, if you do that as a role-playing game, you would be able to de-emphasize the point structure, right? When we look at board games, we often talk about, how did you incentivize them to behave the way you wanted to? What reward system are you using? What's the carrot that you're, dangling in front of them to make them do the in-game behaviors that you want them to do? But role-playing is a little more freeform, right? Where it's like, well, how would this make you feel? Would this person actually do that thing that you're talking about, or that you're contemplating? What would somebody in that role do? And then after you do it, then we can talk about the consequences of that. And really then later on, we can pull it all apart in the debrief. So I made a game called Ties That Bind with Jesse Wright. And they and I wrote this game about, it's in a compilation called Love and Resistance that was put out by Camden Wright and Kate Bullock. And it is a game literally about pulling families apart at the border. So when a family immigrates, or tries to immigrate, they may get separated from each other, like children and parents, children, parents and parents, when they get taken to different areas of border crossing, facilities. And this game was about that. And so we used lots of embodied techniques. It was more like a LARP, now that people have told me what LARPing is. I always thought of LARPing as like just boffer LARPs. And so it's like, does it interest me? So I never really paid attention. But a couple of days ago, my friend said, why do you write LARPs? I said, I don't know. And then she started talking about them. It was Banana, actually. And I told her about Ties That Bind. She kind of knew about it already. She said, that's a LARP, Sen. You wrote a LARP. Because what you do in Ties That Bind is the game master who is playing the authority figures, like the guards and the government and whoever, will basically say, okay, the family members that were once huddled around a table, now you're sitting apart from each other, and each stage, and now you're put in the four corners of the room. Now you're facing the corner, not facing inside. And so as the game gets progressively like worse and worse, honestly, for the players, they are more and more disconnected from each other, not just in character, but physically. And so I've had a lot of people say that they're like, I never want to play that again, but I am so glad that I played it. So it's this really weird game where it's like, they learned something about it. They learned about this act of what it would be like to be ripped apart from your family for like no good reason at all, other than some law or whatever that might be somewhere on some book, and treated like less than human and all that kind of stuff. And it's a really interesting exercise because at the end of it, then we can talk about all of that. Now imagine if I just let them go. They would not feel very good about any of this, right? One of the players, because we had an extra player one night, I said, okay, you're going to be my guard. You get to play the guard. And, I would tell him in between scenes, I'd say, okay, if they make any complaint, just hold up your finger like a gun and threaten to shoot them. And if they ask you questions, just say, I'm just doing my job. I'm just doing my job. And later on that night, after the game was finished, he was freaking out because he goes, I, without question, put a gun to somebody's head. Like he realized as he was playing, even though it's just a game, it's like, I didn't even question you when you told me to do that. I'm just following orders. I'm just doing my job. I said, yeah, right? Just like a lot of guards or cops or border crossing agents and all those people. They always just say, I'm just doing my job. Why does it have to be at the end of a gun? And all those questions. So we talk about all this stuff. We do this debrief. And it's quite enlightening to people to see both sides in some ways. Like, oh, I can see how, in high pressure situations, how a guard could just do these things. And once you put on, your black body armor and your face mask and your riot shield, and you're not human anymore. You're a machine that is made to crash into people, right? So there's all these kinds of things that we bring out through this one-page game that uses, it's literally, it uses recipe cards and whiteout and markers. That's it, right? Because I wanted to make art. I like artifacts in games. I like people having tangible things that they take away with them or that they give to me, and I'll send them pictures a year later and say, do you remember playing this? They're like, oh my God, yes. Wow. Look at that. So the idea behind Ties That Bind is that when you make your character, you basically are just writing memories of your life on your card. Here's a memory with this person, between this person and me. Here's a memory between this other person and me, and I write them down. I went to Grandma's farm with Mom. I rode on the horses with Billy. And eventually, as we play the game, you erase them, or I cover them with whiteout. As the GM, I'll just walk over and cover it with whiteout. And then between each scene, I ask them to write a memory of the last scene. And then in the debrief, I say, hey, take that, hold it up, look at it quickly. What's the first thing you see? And all of them are like, the bad memories. They're covering up everything. Even the stuff that I didn't get to white out, it's still obfuscating all that. I said, yeah, think about that. Think about what we're doing to people when we incarcerate them for these types of reasons. We're basically rewriting their history, right? We're covering up the good times. Now this becomes the focal point of their life. Right, this negative thing. So yeah, a lot of that. What I will caution people, if you're trying to make a game that is helping people or trying to make people be a little more empathetic towards a situation that real people have gone through, just remember that it can be traumatic, but B, people that have gone through that, if they see the work, they may be re-traumatized by that. And these are the people you're supposed to be helping, right? So it's a really fine line to walk. I had this discussion with one of the designers of BioShock the other day, and he was like, going on about authorial intent. Like, as the author of this game, that's not my intent. I said, yeah, sure. But my intent is to create empathy. So I have to be worried about it. He goes, my intent is to make a game. So I don't understand all these trigger warnings. I don't understand why I should do that. I don't understand why I should be responsible for, how people take my game. And if, let's say somebody hurts themselves, self-harms because of BioShock, am I to blame? It's like, well, that wasn't the purpose of Bioshock. That wasn't what Bioshock was for. He just wasn't getting it because he was so worried about authorial intent. That's not what I meant. That's not what I meant. It's like, doesn't matter what you meant. It matters that there's impact, and let's deal with the impact and then talk about intent. That's one. But B, you didn't have that intent. So, you can't sit up and worry about all the possible outcomes. But I did have an intent when I wrote this. I'm sure the people who wrote Papers, Please, the video game, have an intent behind it. And so when we do have an intent, that's when we have to be very concerned with, are we, loading trauma onto people who have already been traumatized? And how do we, protect them from that if that's necessary? Which, I think it is, but there you go. So yeah, empathy, games can definitely help to create empathy. Just be aware that, there are different types of empathy, and what type are we getting at when we are working on games, and how does that, link up to how protective we have to be of people as well. So there's a bunch of stuff in there, but there you go, empathy. But even stuff that isn't distinctly written to try to create or demonstrate empathy, some of those games, I was talking to you last time about Elizabeth Sempat's book, Empathy Engines. Games that don't even intend to have a message, sometimes have a message based on the designers or authors' political slant sometimes, depending on their the world that they live in, the world that they've experienced. Because a lot of times we're looking at it through the lens of that author, right? So, for example, in a game, let's say like SimCity, if you're playing SimCity and there are police in SimCity, how do those police run? That's based on whoever designed it, how they think police run. And so their biases may be in there, ingrained into that system. We often think about machine learning as, totally unbiased, but it's unfortunately not. Machine learning is, it's coded by humans. It's filled with data that is mined from humans. It may, in fact, have biases in it. And we have to be very aware of how we are creating systems that are learning from humans. Like people have talked about, we made an AI bot that data mined Twitter and would tweet or something like that, right? And then, within 25 tweets, it's already spouting racist rhetoric or whatever, right? So there's examples of these things where what we feed the machine is what is going to come out. And oftentimes we aren't curating what we feed them because we're just feeding them everything. And when we feed them everything, we also have to be aware of the biases in the everything. It means that we're not talking about a lot of people who are maybe of color, people who can't afford to be, the technology to be on Twitter. We're not thinking about children. We're not thinking about maybe older adults who aren't on social media, right? So what does that AI represent? Right? It represents probably the average Twitter user. It doesn't represent everybody. And that's sort of the problem with how I think society views a lot of, engines, and games are one of them, is that, these are totally unbiased. It's like, no, they got some biased in there. And I would much, much rather have somebody legitimately state, this is my bias. We were talking about research and stuff before, and that's what we have to do as researchers, is we say at the bottom, here's all the caveats. I am employed as this. I am funded by that. Here's where, my allegiances lie. And I think as designers, we need to be transparent about some of that as well. Perhaps, right? I think there's sometimes where it really is like, yeah, I'm super left leaning, so take my game with that grain of salt. If you want to kind of dissect it, that may be why it looks the way it does. So I don't know. There's a lot of stuff about empathy that we can get into games that is subtle, and there's some stuff that is like we talked about it last time, slapping you across the face with the Fisher morality. So depends on what kind of avenue you'd like to take. I personally think both are okay. That you can totally slap people across the face. You're just going to drive some people away and then have more people come who, you're preaching to the choir in that case. The problem with the subtle stuff is that sometimes it gets lost in the mix to the point where it doesn't have the intended effect. So it's hard. It's a real balancing act to affect positive change through something that is not thought of as being something that normally does that, right? So people don't think of games as agents of change, but they really are. They can shape thoughts and behaviors for years and years and years. Like if you think about generations of people who have played certain games, I don't know, let's say Mass Effect. Say if you're a Mass Effect player, you may have a very different viewpoint on love and life than somebody who just plays Call of Duty, right? So different games can shape people in different ways. And for people who say there's no morality ingrained in this, and you might want to think about that again. There probably isn't a lot in something like Flappy Birds, but there's definitely messaging in games like, Call of Duty or whatever, right? So it's stuff to think about, because they are anchored in the real world, right? Even games that aren't anchored in the real world still have real world messaging because their authors are human who live in a real world, right? So all those things to think about.
I am very curious. You mentioned that there's different kinds of empathy.
Oh, yeah.
I think that there's a very common understanding of what empathy is. I'm curious what you mean by there's multiple kinds.
In terms of like empathy, there's three major types in some school of thought. We'll use this one. There are three major types. So that emotional empathy, the cognitive empathy, those are the first two. So emotional empathy would be like, I understand how you're feeling. I feel the same as you, that kind of thing. And then there's a cognitive one, which is like, I understand why you're feeling that way. So those are like the sort of the two basic ones. And the third level would be like is compassionate empathy, right? Where I'm going to sort of help you make that change. So again, cognitive is just understanding, knowing that you feel that way. Hey, I get that you feel sad. Emotional would be, I feel sad for you because you feel sad, right? Do you get the difference? There's a slight difference there. And then compassionate empathy is like that need to help somebody, right? Because you have that compassion for them. And games can work on all those levels, right? Just like movies can work on all those levels, right? There are definitely movies out there that make you like feel a certain way. That's that emotional empathy. There's some movies where it's like, I understand why that actor had those motivations, or where that character has those motivations. That's that cognitive empathy. But then there's some movies that make you kind of get out of your seat and say, I need to talk to somebody about this right now. I need to do something about this. We need to discuss it. Those would be more into the compassion, empathy level. Obviously, doing something about stuff is even more altruistic than just, talking about it on Facebook with your friends. So, for example, if you haven't seen the movie, this goes back to prisons, 13th. It's about the American prison system. And after you watch it, you'll probably feel 2, if not 3 of these types of empathy. Which is the opposite of what the prison industrial complex wants you to feel. They don't want you to feel for these prisoners at all, right? And it's through things like that, through movies, through podcasts like Ear Hustle, where I think people are getting to understand, oh, prisoners are humans too, right? They're not just a number. They're not nameless. They're not faceless. They're brothers. They're cousins. They're sons. They're fathers. They're mothers. They're daughters. They're all these things. And when we when we make people nameless and faceless, it is very difficult to empathize with them, and it makes it easier to do bad things to them. Right? It's dehumanization of the other is huge part of war propaganda, all that kind of stuff. So the idea of looking at empathy on all these levels to try to get to compassion, you may never get there for some people. You may get there really quickly for other people. So some people are wired to be just compassionate people. Some people need a little more proving to say, you might want to think about this a little more. No, I understand, but I'm not doing anything about it. It doesn't bother me, right? So it's an interesting thing. So there are definitely people out there. There's a book about the bad things about empathy, like why it's bad to be too empathetic, and that would be more on the emotional empathy side, where you're so like feeling for this person that you can't do anything, or that you can't make a good decision because of it. There are, and you see that all the time in movies, right? Where like the president has to either push the button to launch the nukes or save everybody. But to save everybody, he has to push the buttons to launch the nukes. Wait a minute. He's in a moral conundrum. And those types of things are sometimes you just have to do things by the numbers for the betterment of the majority of people. When it's those kind of binary decisions, that's what some people would say to argue against the act of empathy or the idea of empathy, or everybody should be better at empathy. Whereas people who might understand empathy a little bit differently or see different levels of empathy will say, yeah, I get what you're saying. However, have you thought about these other types of empathy? When we say empathy, we might mean all of these other types of things. So if you're really interested in empathy and emotional intelligence, like Brene Brown is a really good lecturer on that subject from like a positive psychology type of view. So yeah, but like I said, there are definitely people who argue against empathy. There's a whole book against empathy, and it's interesting to read because it's like it does make you question, oh, is empathy bad? And at the end of it, I wasn't thinking that. I was like, oh, I see what you're saying. I understand what you're getting at. And yes, I can see sometimes where empathy could be a bad thing. However, in general, I think empathy is a really good thing. Just like anything. I mean, putting everything on a binary of good or bad is bad. To put it on a binary, it's not super helpful all the time. And we tend to do that. And I've found over the pandemic that more and more people are getting like super, super binary about things. Like it's good or it's bad, or you're with me or you're against me. And all these types of very polarizing ideas, which are, I think that's dangerous in a lot of ways. That can be dangerous to think that way, or not dangerous, but just very limited. But I get why people think that. Again, using my empathy at the cognitive level, I understand why some people might think that way. A lot of people who have been hurt by other people say, if you aren't positively on my side, you're just as good as being against me, right? It's the idea right now, but it's not good enough to be non-racist. You got to be anti-racist, and that I actually believe, because we spent my whole life, pretty much 40 years, try to be non-racist. I don't see color. Oh, I my best friend's black. Whatever platitudes you're throwing at racism, it didn't help because last year we saw, major cities on fire in the United States of America because of race riots. So 40 years down the drain, I guess, maybe because we didn't go all the way to compassionate empathy. Yeah. And, I think there's a lot of issues with language use as well around all of this type of stuff. Like the idea of privilege it's a tough pill for people to swallow, or, you know, any of the terms that intersectionality uses is very, very difficult for a lot of people to stomach. Like you hear that word and they're like, oh, nope, I'm out. It's like, well, if you just listen, but we've been beating each other over the head so much with a lot of these words. because we haven't seen each other in person in 2 years or like a year and a bit, that it's been, I think that's what's coming of this. But back to games and empathy and using empathy in games. Yeah, I mean, I think you can get all three levels. Again, just be very careful with how you use them and be very careful with, you know, the flip sides of all these things. So the flip side of like emotional empathy is that it can lead to burnout. You know, people will be so distressed by what another person's feeling that they can't take care of themselves, that kind of thing. Um, you know, the problem with being just overly cognitive about your empathy is that a lot of people like, I see it, but they don't do anything about it. I understand, but okay, what are you doing about it? And it's kind of the idea that, oh, I can get in another person's head. I can see what you're thinking. I can figure out how you're feeling. That's a very big step in terms of development of psychology. That'd be like called theory of mind, and having developed a good theory of mind to like walk in somebody else's shoes or whatever. And people who are just focused on the cognitive side of empathy may appear to be calculating, right? Cold and calculating. And then, so you have on one side, you have the cold and calculating person who's just, I understand how you feel, but blah, 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 blah. And then on the other side, you have the really hot, emotional empathy. It's like, I feel everything you're feeling. And because of that, I can't feel my own feelings, or my own feelings are taking over feelings. And then in the middle is what compassionate empathy is all about, which is, you know, weighing both sides of what the numbers look like, of what the feelings are, and kind of coming to a compromise. Compassionate empathy is really about compromise and learning how to do that. So, like, here's the thing. You can 100% stop people from coming into your country if you're American. Do it. It's your country. However, you can also be a lot more compassionate about how you do it. Right? Why are you tearing families apart? Why is this a thing that you're doing? What makes sense about that? I actually literally don't understand why they're doing it. Half the time it's like I don't get it. Because it just seems to fly in the face of reason, unless it's for some other reason that I don't know. Because you know, there may be something where, you know, the longer we hold them, the more money we get or something. I don't know. I don't know what it is, but it seems like a really big cost, a human cost to the people who are incarcerated for this. I don't know what the benefit is. Right? If you want me to be cognitive about it, like mathematical about it, I don't see the benefit at all to doing this. Like, what is the benefit? Because it's not like it's felony murder, right? So that's the other thing. I mean, I get why prisons exist. I don't get why prisons are used for some things, but I get why prisons exist for some other things. So having the two sides of the, you know, cognitive empathy versus the emotional empathy, and trying to be in the middle, that's where it kind of needs to be. And I mean, you hear that in language change, right? So, for example, if one of your friends was abused, and you immediately said, I don't believe it. Like, and they told you who did it. You go, I can't believe he did that. Like, the language now is more of like, you know, I believe you. Tell me what I can do to help. Right? Even if later on it's proved that that person didn't do anything, it's like that. I believe that something happened. Right? That's showing that compassionate empathy as opposed to the cognitive empathy of, I don't believe that happened. Well, it's not really even cognitively empathy. It's actually the opposite of that. It's using language in a way that is not egocentric. Because a lot of times when you're saying, I don't believe you, it doesn't mean I don't, when you say, I can't believe he did that, or they did that, whoever did the thing. What you really mean to say is something like, I've never seen them behave in that way before. But both of those things still basically invalidate the other person's belief, right? And now, in this kind of binary world that we somehow found ourselves living in, now we are no longer to be trusted, right? Are you saying you don't believe me? No, 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 that's not what I said. Well, you literally just said that. You don't believe that this person did that. Right, I did say that. So, a lot of stuff, and that's the thing. It's like, what was the impact? Well, the impact is now that this person doesn't trust me, and now I really can't help this person even though I really want to because they're not going to let me. They don't trust me. Why would they? And so that's the impact. Whereas the intention of what I said was probably to say, I am flabbergasted that this even happened, which still not validating them, right? So some of the times, like, it's like, why don't we just keep those words to ourselves and just do what's helpful for the person? But it's because a lot of times we make things into things about us. Like, we're very egocentric creatures, humans are. From my perspective, I can't see how this person could have done that. That's what you're saying, but really you probably shouldn't say that at all. And, how does gaming change that? I don't know if it does. I don't know if it can. But, I think in terms of just even basic games teach you a lot about interpersonal interaction. They teach you a lot about, communication and turn taking. They teach you a lot about like clarity in what you're trying to say and what you're trying to do. As a designer, you have to be very purposeful in your wording. You have to be very intentful in how you word things. Otherwise, you're going to get misinterpreted as people play your game because you're not in the box, right? You don't come with the book. And so there's a lot of times when, game designers need to actually think about what they're saying a lot more. And so, whereas we might not be able to ingrain empathy into every game we make. And to be honest, I don't want every game that people make to have empathy in it. That would be hard. That would be, maybe moving away from some of the entertainment purpose of some of the games. So not every game has to have empathy, but they can. That's the thing. But what I think the number one skill that game designers in the 21st century need is empathy. Why do we need that? Well, because one of the very most important things that we do as game designers is playtest. And when we are taking and receiving feedback from playtesters, if we don't have empathy, we can't use it. It's hard to use feedback when we're not empathetic to the person as a rational actor. Other things that are very important in terms of empathy and game design is, do you understand your target market? You are making a product, you are making art, you are making all these things, you're making a game. It could be all those things. Like, have you seen some of the beautiful, hardbound role-playing games? They're gorgeous. They're works of art. The writing is art, but it's also a game, and it's also a product. And if you don't know who your audience is, you're writing for no one. And if you're writing for no one, I can guarantee you that it may not sell as well as you think it would, as if you were targeting an audience and understanding and really getting to know that demographic of people. Who are you writing for? Who are your people? What do they like? What do they not like? How do you give them more of what they like and take away stuff they don't like? That's empathy, right? That's using that cognitive empathy, but also the compassionate empathy, where it's like the cognitive is like, oh, okay, I analyze this and I know what's going on. That's my scientific voice, I guess. And then the compassionate empathy was like, okay, let's do something about that. I wrote this so that blah, 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 blah. For example, in Jiangxi, we wrote a section on, how to play as an Asian character if you're not Asian. Right? It's like, hey, you may not want to use accents. You may want to pick a name from these lists. You may all these things that people could or could not do. But the idea is to make it easy for them, show compassion to the player, but also helping them be compassionate to maybe Asian players that are around the table. So you're not like constantly doing these really weird kind of semi-racist microaggressions to your friends around the table if you're trying to speak in a Chinese accent and you are really butchering it. Just don't. There's no need to. So it's having empathy for the players. We also wrote a section with James Mendes Hodes, who is a cultural consultant. We wrote a section on how to be racist, which is a really funny thing. And this is showing compassion. You're saying, Sen, okay, come on, dude. How is writing a section on how to play a racist being compassionate? Well, okay, let me tell you a little bit about it. It's for the GM. It's so the GM doesn't have to relive like totally really racist experiences or describe them. Say, here's how you can do that without doing anything, right? You could just say, oh, this NPC turns her nose up at you as she leaves the restaurant, or as somebody walks in the restaurant, they wrinkle their nose and say it smells funny, and those are really subtle. They're really, those are those microaggressions, but they're not as overt as, somebody walking in and calling you like a slant-eyed chink or something. That is obviously racist, and the GM does not need to do that in the game. So by writing those rules, we're showing compassion to the players, we're showing compassion to people of Chinese culture, and we're showing compassion to the GM themselves, so they don't have to feel worried about this. Here are the boundaries. Like if we didn't write any, some people wouldn't know, and they'd feel all anxious about it. So no, here's how to do it. Here's how you can do it in a way that we think is safe, but still shows the intention without having the impact. There we go, back to intention and impact, right? My intention of what I'm doing is to show you that this NPC is racist towards Chinese people. The impact is going to be smaller because of the rule set that they provided. I guess I provided, right? So the idea of understanding how people play games, how people engage with games, how people might engage with games. So it goes on both sides, right? It's like, hey, if you want to speak with a Chinese accent, how about you don't? Right? Because we understand people do that all the time, right? I fall into accents and I try not to when I'm role playing just because it's not cool. That every time I, have a certain type of character, I use a certain accent. Like, well, how do you do that? It's funny. I asked this question the other day on my Facebook. I said, hey, how come we always use like Scottish accents for dwarves? Why? Why do we do that? Why as a culture do we do that? Why do we always think of British accents as being, cultured and educated and all that kind of stuff? I don't know. But we do, right? As a whole Western culture, we accept these tropes as, easy signifiers of something, right? And so these are things where, like, we're just trying to give you some hints and tips and tricks on how to play the game in a way that is fun and entertaining, but safe. And, it's not that you're not doing interesting things or risky things. They're just safer. It's funny. I was just reading this on Twitter this morning, or maybe it was yesterday, where a GM of another game said that one of his players thanked him for having a really safe game. And he thought about it and he goes, but all your characters have died at least once, and there's always traps and monsters everywhere. It's like, and everybody's like horrible. And she's like, no, the culture of our table is safe. He's like, oh, right. You can have a very deadly, dangerous, dark game and still have a very safe table, which is something that some people just can't seem to rectify that can happen. Right? My game's got to be super edgy and has to have always like, racist things and, belittling of women and all this kind of stuff in order to be super dark and edgy. It's like, nope, does not have to have that. I can write something incredibly horrific and dark. It'll have none of that. Right? You gotta, I don't know, be more creative, bro. I don't know what to tell you. Yeah, like flex those creative muscles you proclaim to have and do something that's not that. That's not using, I don't know, like mental disability as a panic point. That's, not using racism as a point of, horror and things like that. I mean, you can, but if you're doing that, I mean, at least treat it with some care. That's really all we ask for, to be honest. We can have these difficult conversations. We can have games about difficult topics. It's just you need to be very aware of how you're doing it, and are you the person that should be doing that? And that also takes empathy, right? Is understanding that this is not my story to tell is a big piece of being empathetic to, like, well, what would it look like if I did write this? How would people react? What would they say? Oh, I guess I won't write this then. It's pretty simple. It's funny. I have this game that I've wanted to do for a year or two. I listen to a lot of podcasts, and every time I listen to a podcast, I message Banana. I say, Banana, I got a game idea. Because podcasts just kind of, for some reason, podcasts, because they're audio only, allow me to dream about ideas and visualize things in a very different way than a movie will or a book. So when I heard one about the Great Dismal Swamp, which is in the southeastern states ish, it's a swamp that is huge, like ginormous swamp land that was used by runaway enslaved people to basically live there when they ran away from their masters. Right. And so it's a great story because it's a swamp. And because it's a swamp, there's no history of it, because anything that fell would rot or sink. And so there's not a lot of written history. There's some oral history. And the problem with the Great Dismal Swamp, or one of the problems, there's probably many, like crocodiles and things, but one of the other problems was that, or alligators, I'm not sure who lives there. I'll have to do that research, right? Is that at some point, I think, was it George Washington? It might have been George Washington, and his brother owned a company that was actually cutting it back because they needed the wood to make coal. And so they'd be cutting back at the swamp, and that would risk exposing the runaway enslaved people. And so this Great Dismal Swamp was like the center of what's called a maroon culture, and they would go out of there and bring back more people. So they repatriate enslaved people from their old plantation or whatever and run back to the Great Dismal Swamp. And so I love the idea of this fight for freedom, and the story is an amazing story. But is it my story to tell? And as you can tell by my name and who I am, I'm not Black, and I'm not from my family isn't from that lineage, and so it's not my story to tell. No matter how much I want to tell it. Now, could I be part of a team that did that? Sure. But should it be just me alone? No. And I think that's one of the things that a lot of people don't stop and question as much as maybe they should. It's like, who is your audience? Why are you the right person to write for that? And it's not like, I don't want to say that people who aren't of color can't write about places that they don't, that they're not from, or cultures that they're not a part of. That's not what I'm trying to say. I'm saying do the research, include people of that culture in your research, maybe even in the actual making of the game, the writing of the game, and really seek out the viewpoints of the people who are most affected by this thing. Like, if I was to tell this story and then I didn't realize for some reason that this was a really sore point in the Black community, well, that's on me. But maybe if I had gone to that community and talked to them and said, hey, I'd like to do this, what do you think? They would have warned me off and said, no, don't do that, because, right? And I find a lot of creators are just, oh, this is cool, let me do something with it. And that shows kind of a lack of empathy. Like, you might want to ask people who have lived that history to see if that is, okay to make into a game. And that's the other thing. Like, games are very different because games are seen as frivolous, as entertainment. And we know they can be more. We know they can be much more than that. But a lot of people may react very negatively when you try to gamify their life, their family's history, all that kind of stuff in a way that, especially if it's a way that's not treated fairly or kindly, right? People aren't necessarily asking you to lie, but they're asking you to not lie. If you get my gist, the difference, right? So I mean, even when we wrote Jiangshi, Banana and I are both Chinese. We come from Chinese families, and we hire Chinese consultants. Why? Because we don't know everything. We don't have all the answers. We don't know all the lived experiences. Neither of our families own restaurants, so we hired consultants whose families ran Chinese restaurants for like 80, 90 years. They've run the Chinese restaurants, passed down through generations. And so we talked about that because that is really who this game is about. So it's that idea, as my glasses slip some more, you know, I talked about this on a forum today, that cultural consultation, cultural sensitivity, but even like any of these sensitivities that we have, that we're talking about, and empathy in particular, it's not knowing everything. It's literally not what it's about. It's about knowing what you don't know and having the wherewithal to ask the right questions, to find the right people, to fill in those gaps in your knowledge. That's what cultural consulting is all about. That's what being culturally sensitive is about. It's not about going, hey, look at that cool thing, let's make a game about it. It's like, hey, there's a cool thing. Let me find out a little bit more to make sure I'm not stepping on anybody's toes. A lot of game creators are like, oh, is there a game in that setting yet? No, good, I got it. It's mine. Claimed. Or, oh, does that title been used yet? No, good, I can use it. And there's so much of that it becomes a problem when people, use other cultures that they're not really a part of to create a game out of. And that again, like I said, is part of the perception of games as this thing, but that's not serious. But there are serious games out there for sure. It's a whole field of study called serious games. Anyway, yeah, I just hope that people would start asking more questions about what they do and, the cultures that they use in games versus just kind of wholesale appropriating it. Really, a lot of it ends up being quite appropriative. Even when they claim to be appreciative, right? And that's the thing, like they might have all intentions to be appreciative, but it ends up kind of coming off appropriative because they may not have put enough work into it. And that work doesn't always cost money. Some of it's just a lot of legwork. Some of it's involving people. Some of it might cost money, but not all of it does.
This has been a fantastic conversation once again. Second go around.
And we talked about totally different stuff.
We did. That's very true.
Pretty much.
Yeah. I mean, so is there anything you'd like to plug?
I guess right now you can look out for one of the games that I made for a London local app company called Big Blue Bubble. And it is a game called My Singing Monsters. It's actually really cool because it is a game that grows with your playing group. So if you play with, say, a family and you have little kids, you can start off real simple and then add more pieces to it as the children get more skilled. And so it's a really cool thing to, at the end of this whole thing, once you have all 5 parts of the game in play, you have this game that adults will enjoy, and they'll probably enjoy the little parts too, because it's not like it's like a kiddie game. It's just less parts. It's just simpler, but it's not necessarily simpler strategically. And you learn, like, everything is additive. So you're learning how to play the game, the basics, and then the next time you add more stuff, now you're just adding to it. It's not a whole new game. So it's quite cool. And then later on in the summer, Rat Queens is coming out. It's pretty cool. Yeah, Rat Queens is a comic that is was written by fellow Canadian Curtis Weeb, and Erica Bouyeris and myself got to do the design. Jesse Wright is doing the development, and it's going to be coming out through Deepwater Games out of Michigan. So yeah, it's a very tight connected group. It's everybody that I host the Maple Syrup Show with, and then Deepwater, very good friends of ours. And yeah, we're really happy about it. It is, So you'd think with Rat Queens, oh, it's going to be a role-playing game. No, because that's a low-hanging fruit. So we made a cooperative strategy game that's, got a little bit of deck building, some dice rolling, fun stuff happening in it. It's pretty queer. Happy Pride Month. And it's gonna be hopefully a game that the fans of the comic book series will enjoy, and then the people outside of that will say, "Oh, that looks really cool. Let's play it," and then find the comic book series because the comics are really fun.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Sen, for coming on again.
Thanks for having me again.
Hell yeah. All right, everyone. Thank you so much for listening, and we'll catch you next time.